This afternoon is about myths and monsters and a little bit of science. And that really defines, I suppose, Loch Ness in many ways. But I have a problem, and the problem is that over 1,000 people, as Dr. Paxton has said, have seen Loch Ness monsters, and I think they are honest and also sober. Now, but I can't find them. So I've got a problem, and I'd like to take you through that problem and see if you can help me. Now, I was going to show you, that's right, the kelpies, that's right. We heard about kelpies. You know they're a shape-shifting piece of very bad news indeed. It would spoil your whole day to even see or speak of a kelpie. But that's the mythical side. By the way, there's another mythical horse there. Can anybody tell me what it is? Yes? A unicorn, exactly. You've been watching your Harry Potter. Okay, so monsters in Loch Ness were not very nice until about 1933, when the water bailiff, Alex Campbell, who was also a correspondent to the Inverness Courier, wrote about the experience of a Mr. and Mrs. Mackay. So he's got a lot to do with this, and he linked it to the kelpies. Next year, we have Rupert Gould, an author, investigated the sightings, but 3 years before, he had written a book about sea serpents, the case for the sea serpent. And he'd been studying reports of sea monsters and sea serpents, and this really was a Scandinavian tradition from Norway. And at the beginning of the 19th century, a similar creature was also seen by hundreds of people off the coast of New England. So he found that that sort of multi-humped monster was seen also off the west coast of Scotland. And by the way, that sort of monster is still with us, the sea serpent. These are the pictures of some of the witnesses that contributed to Rupert Gould's book. So we had, he thought, sea serpents in Loch Ness. And that's also a form that you can find in other parts of the world. This is Lake Tahoe in Nevada, where I took this picture of a sea serpent alive and well. Now, there's a problem with sea serpents. And the problem is that they wiggle the wrong way. That is a snake. That is a serpent, and we're looking at it from above. So it wiggles this way, whereas sea serpents wiggle that way. So we've got a problem with that. Now, you heard about Mary Anning this morning, and Mary Anning was digging fossils out of the cliffs at Lyme Regis, one of which was a plesiosaur, that long-necked creature, contemporary with dinosaurs, but it wasn't a dinosaur. And unfortunately, of course, plesiosaurs are extinct, aren't they? But we would like them to be there, wouldn't we? Of course we would. We love prehistoric monsters. Now, Mary Anning's fossils actually generated a lot of interest. And the plesiosaur entered literature. It was even made into concrete models after the Great Exhibition of 1852. And you can see them to this day in Sydenham. And towards the end of that century, the 19th century, the sightings of sea monsters began to include things very much like plesiosaurs. You can see it down there. And at Loch Ness, in 1933, an English couple called the Spicers were driving along the South Shore Road, and they saw this long-necked thing going across the road, would you believe? That was the first time anybody saw a long neck on a Loch Ness monster. And from, again, Rupert Gould's book, we have these illustrations. It wasn't until September, some months after the Spicers saw that long-necked thing, that we have long-necked reports from Loch Ness. And there it is. There is the iconic picture taken a year later by a London surgeon, the icon known all over the world of the upraised head and neck. But we've got another problem, because recently it's been pointed out that perhaps plesiosaurs can't raise their heads and necks like that. And it's all to do with spinous processes, these lumps on top of the neck vertebrae. You see, it could bend its neck down, but if it tried to come up, these would lock together. So that's disappointing, isn't it? We've got a plesiosaur that cannot raise its head and neck, and at the same time, we've got a sea serpent which is wiggling the wrong way. So what are we to do about that? Whoops. I did, thank you. Yes, I'm back now. So the Loch Ness investigation began in 1962, putting cameras around Loch Ness for a decade, for 10 years, trying to reproduce those classic pictures, including the surgeon's picture. And they failed to do that. But they did find out what the sea serpent was. The Caledonian Canal runs through Loch Ness, as you know, and it comes out here in Inverness. And quite big ships have been moving through it ever since 1820. And those ships leave wakes. And this picture from the 1960s, while the Loch Ness investigation were actually there, shows you a boat wake sea serpent. And there's my one, which was also a boat wake in Lake Tahoe. So, sea serpents had come into Loch Ness, if you like, had been investigated in Loch Ness, and we had found the answer in Loch Ness. Not just Loch Ness monsters, but sea serpents. What about those long necks? Well, there's the iconic picture, and there's the surgeon, a respectable surgeon. But the surgeon was a bit of a lad. And he actually took some plates that had been prepared for him, photographic plates in those days, and he had actually constructed something. Now, the reason the surgeon's picture lasted so long was because you couldn't see the perspective. So, if you can't see the background and it's calm, as Dr. Paxton's pointed out, then you can be mistaken. Now, that was no mistake. But actually, there was a way in which seeing heads and necks are not fakes, but actually mistakes. And no less a person than the water bailiff, Alex Campbell, actually reported in 1933 a 30-foot plesiosaur, which he then retracted just about a month later, after seeing cormorants distorted by mirage on Loch Ness, probably in very calm weather, not like this picture. But you can see the similarity. Now, I designed the public exhibition at Drumnadrochit, and because of that, I'm allowed to have a laboratory there, and as Stuart has pointed out, most of my work has been on fairly conventional science sampling and that sort of thing. But it wasn't always like that. This is a younger version. My little submarine. So that was in the 70s when the search had moved underwater, because we hadn't found things. We baited the submarine and hoped to see something swimming over the top. And if we had, I think we'd have probably been up in a bit of a hurry. 1987, I had the privilege of leading a rather large expedition. I had a few more accomplices then, Operation Deep Scan, a sonar search, a sweep all the way from one end of the loch to the other. And I still didn't find Loch Ness monsters. So things are getting difficult. See, I think that what happens is that we make our myths rational, if we can. First of all, you have the kelpies, which we stopped believing in because we stopped being superstitious. Then we have the sea serpents, and then we found problems. Science found the problems, and so we thought, well, plesiosaurs, it looks like plesiosaurs now. Plesiosaurs actually existed because dragons existed, Mary Anning found them. Why weren't sea monsters plesiosaurs? So I think all the time we're trying to be rational. Loch Ness, and here we're trying to be very rational, is a big piece of water. There's more water in it than all of England and Wales put together. You could put every human being on Earth into it 3 times over. But on a world scale, it's not huge, and it's certainly not huge by comparison with the ocean. It's the legacy of the last ice age. In fact, it was a fault line long before that, but the mountains have been worn many times by ice. They don't yield many nutrients to the water. Loch Ness is not a productive lake. This is a sonar trace across it. The little spots are fish, and this line here is the thermocline because you get slightly warmer water lying on top. So basically, there's the food chain, the little plankton feeding the plant plankton, feeding the small animal plankton, feeding the fish. And we also have the river, which allows salmon to come up. So let's look at the sorts of animals that might be Loch Ness monsters. Reptiles. Now, what are the problems with reptiles? They're cold-blooded. There's an aquatic reptile, it's a crocodile. They have limitations. They tend to live in warm countries. Same applies, in a way, to reptiles. Here's a turtle that I met earlier this year. Now, there are exceptions. This is a leatherback turtle, but it still has to come ashore to lay eggs. And of course, when the eggs hatch, then there will be lots of juveniles which develop without parental care. And we haven't caught any in Loch Ness, no little ones. What about amphibians? Now, there's a good thing about amphibians. This is the Japanese salamander. They can sort of breathe underwater through their skins. So that's really good if you're looking for an elusive creature in Loch Ness. But the trouble is there are no saltwater amphibians. And they also lay lots of eggs, so there'll be lots of juveniles. Without their mum around them, we might catch them, and we don't. So what about mammals? Now, mammals are quite a variety of them. All these creatures that I'm putting up here now have been suggested by different people at different times. And in fact, mammals have been mentioned several times. Now, they can have long necks, but these northern elephant seals illustrate some of the problems. You can't have a long neck unless you're sitting on the land, because I don't know whether you've noticed, but if you're swimming in a swimming pool and wave to somebody, you sink, don't you? Because of the weight. And that's one of the problems, of course, with the idea of plesiosaurs having long necks that would come up. And of course, seals have to come ashore to breed and fight, and also to molt. And there we are. They lie about. Now that is a really beautiful animal, isn't it? Well, I think that's what he thinks of you. Okay. Whales have been suggested. This chap, Roy Mackle, he suggested just about every sort of animal in the animal kingdom. So, whales can be quite active at the surface. There we are. And they have to breathe at the surface. They do give birth in the water, which is helpful, but they have a high metabolism, have to breathe quite often, and they eat a lot as well. And we haven't got a lot of food in Loch Ness. There is one creature, and it's just taken a breath. What is it? Toby? Yes, it's a manatee, exactly. And they've been suggested too. They breathe very surreptitiously, very secretly, if you like. But they're vegetarians. And the side walls of Loch Ness are so steep and the water is so dark that the band of rooted vegetation is very narrow indeed. Fish. You see how we're trying to get more and more rational? I think since the 1970s, really, we've been looking for fish. One idea is the giant eel. It's suggested that eels might come into Loch Ness and get trapped there and become huge. They come in from the Sargasso Sea. Well, you've got a perfectly good river down there, and I can't see eels being trapped in Loch Ness. If an eel is trapped, it'll get out and walk. It's just on a rainy, wet night, they'll go through the wet grass. So I don't believe in that. And the other issue is, what about the lack of the little ones, the juveniles, the ones we don't catch in our nets and don't find inside the fish that we catch? Sorry, question there? Right, good point. And that is where the wels, the European catfish, comes in. Because my colleague Dick Rayner has suggested that the catfish, which is a horrible fish, as you see, it's a mouth with a tail, and it's very predatory. But he's suggesting that they wouldn't breed in Loch Ness, because they won't breed anyway until the water temperature reaches 20 degrees, which doesn't happen very often in Loch Ness, and that they'd been put in by man. They'd been introduced. So that is one way that a fish, supposedly one capable of living for 100 years, might have been popped into the loch and caused some of the sightings. My favourite is actually the sturgeon, not known to breed in Britain, but they have run up rivers 50 miles or more. And there is a report from 1932 by Miss Mackay of a crocodile-like creature coming up the River Ness, and I do wonder about that. There's quite a big sturgeon in the Natural History Museum in London, and this is Herman. Herman the sturgeon on exhibition at Portland in Oregon. And as you see, he's a lot longer than I am. He's a white sturgeon, and our sturgeon don't get quite as big as that. But that is the way in which the current researchers are thinking. Steve Feltham, have you heard of Steve Feltham over the other side of the loch? He's been there a long time, and he's beginning to trend towards the catfish idea as a possibility. It doesn't mean that we can bring evidence for it. It's just a way in which we have made our myths more and more believable with a little bit of science. And so I leave you with the thought that there will be a Loch Ness monster as long as you want there to be one. But you should use some ingenuity, some thinking, if you like, a little science, to actually work out what sort of monster it might be. Thank you.